Brian Burns notified he's getting franchise tagged. Transition. Try that one more time. Transition tagged, which is important. Because now the Panthers can try to wriggle free. They can try to escape, get away from the clutches of the franchise's bad decision-making. That's what they're all about. That's what we've seen since Dan Morgan and Dave Canales have taken over. It hasn't been a lot of, hey, let's build towards something new and awesome. It's been a lot of, let's try to fix what is drastically broken. We'll talk about Hayden Hurst being cut today. We can talk, or notified that he will be cut today. We can talk about Dante Jackson, same thing earlier this week. But let's start with the Brian Burns news. There are only two good outcomes for the Panthers when it comes to Brian Burns. And both take a certain art, a certain skill, a certain finesse, a certain amount of luck to get there. The first would be a long-term reasonable contract, something that is of fair value, something that you are not overpaying for. The second would be a trade that brings back 2 first-round picks or more, because then you don't have to wear the shame of passing up 2 first-round picks and plus, a third-round pick from the Rams a couple of years ago, and instead getting significantly less. So the two good outcomes are either a long-term reasonable contract for Brian Burns or a trade that brings back 2 first-round picks or more. There will be a market for Brian Burns. I'm not sure it'll be that rich. Here's Chris Canty on one of the teams that could make a move for Burns.
I can see a world where Carolina looks to recoup some of the draft capital that they gave up for Bryce Young, offering up 2 twos and a defensive-minded coach in Dan Quinn to get an elite player that is scheme diverse on the defensive side of the ball. Makes a whole lot of sense for the Washington Commanders. I could see a world where both of those sides make that magic happen.
Happen is the end of that phrase. Chris Canty, by the way, you can hear him every morning right here, 99.9 The Fan, as one of 3 co-hosts of Unsportsmanlike. Sure, if the Commanders' defensive coordinator, here's the thing. Now that they've put the franchise tag on him, it becomes much more expensive for other teams to talk to Brian Burns. Transition tag means Brian Burns can talk to other teams. He can go negotiate. He can agree to a contract. Then they have to present that contract, that offer sheet, to the Panthers. The Panthers can either match it, sign it, and say, you now play for us again on that same deal you signed with them, or they can say, no dice, we don't want it, but the other team has to give them 2 first-round picks. I don't know where this is going to end up. There are many different ways it could end up. I don't believe, like many are saying, this is a sign that Brian Burns is definitely out of town. Could it be a tag and trade? Yes. Could it be they have until July to work out a long-term deal and they get it done? Also, yes. What I do know is Dan Morgan and Dave Canales better have a plan, and they better just be executing it. This is probably something they had to diagram in their interviews for the job. The Brian Burns situation is not a surprise. The Panthers have been there for like 2 years. You knew you'd be here. So here's like the bigger arcing question. How do you wriggle free from the trap that the previous regime put you in? That's one of the questions I'd have asked in the interview talking with Dan Morgan if I were Dave Tepper. Hey, man, listen. This Brian Burns thing has gotten real sticky. Lot of booby traps around here. How would you navigate it? When Dave Canales gets brought in, same thing. Is he a part of your future? If not, how do you maximize that value? The Panthers are hoping someone else will do the hard work for them and they'll draw up a contract that they can just sign. I don't think anyone's going to do that because I don't think anyone wants to risk giving up the 2 first-round picks. The real hard part is, can you have a great relationship with a player that is in full disagreement with you? We talked about it with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Mike Evans. They were in disagreement for a year. They just came together on a kumbaya contract that likely makes Mike Evans a buck for life. We saw the Ravens do it with Lamar Jackson. He was recording videos in a car somewhere talking about how, they weren't appreciating him. There was a report of a trade request. There was the transition tag. Sure, go talk to anybody you want to talk to. They were getting ugly in the media. He didn't even have an agent. They came together on a kumbaya $250 million deal. Everybody's happy. Now it's, Ravens Nation, Flock Nation, whatever they say up there. Can you do that, Panthers? Because keep in mind, the Panthers have the negotiating leverage here. Should they? I don't think so. Right? Like, if we're talking about what's deserved, I'm not sure why the Panthers are sitting there like all the cards are in our favor. We just had the worst season in the NFL. But NFL Players Association use this as a reminder. Next time you have a CBA, don't give up franchise tags. Because the Panthers, if they don't want to, they do not have to trade or even entertain really trading Brian Burns for 2 years. Tag him this year. You can tag him next year. That's $24 million this year against the cap, $24 million cash. The following year would be 120% of $24 million, whatever that is. A little bit more. Not going to do that math on air. 20% more, probably around $30 million. And guess what? That would be less than he would get on a long-term contract. So he is locked in to 2 years that he can't really go negotiate and find the open market. So the Panthers have the leverage of 2 more years of control. So their full goal is to get him to take the least amount of money. Do you realize how good you have to be, how socially aware you have to be, how much of a sweet talker you have to be looking at Brian Burns and have everybody know my goal is to make it so you get as little money as possible and then still be at a point where you can negotiate in good faith with each other and have a good relationship after that? That's where you have to be. And oh, by the way, we might give you a deal. You might think you found your place, and who knows, we might trade you next year. Hayden Hurst probably thought he was going to have a nice little run here in Carolina when he signed a 3-year deal, when his second year in the contract was set up as such that if you cut him, you didn't get any cap space back, $52,000. But guess what? They cut him earlier today. It is not easy doing what Dan Morgan and Dave Canales are being asked to do, which is fix a whole bunch of problems that they had, or I was about to say they had no problem in no part in creating. Dan Morgan was there, but at least he wasn't the head man creating the problems. He was the assistant GM, not the head GM. They've got to solve these problems before they can even start building. It's like this. Do you ever watch HGTV?
Sometimes.
There was a while where my wife and I went through a phase where all those fixer-uppers and all those, like the, hey, we're going to come in and turn your house into your dream house show. And there was always, right, you took over the house, you thought you knew all the problems, right? Oh, we see a little bit of water damage over there. We'll get that cleaned up. And, oh, gosh, what a outdated kitchen. We're gonna get all that. And then there's always the big oh, no, right? There's always
always one.
We found mold in the ceiling.
Uh-oh.
There's always
no.
You need to put a beam across the middle of the living room to make it structurally sound. I don't know how they got the permitting to put it this way. There's always the big uh-oh, and this is gonna eat into our budget. Like, the Panthers, to this point, have not had the big oh no. Everything that Dan Morgan and Dave Canales are trying to solve are the things you spot in your walkthrough with the inspector, right? Your inspector's going, That water heater looks like it's going to have to be upgraded. Your HVAC is 15 years old. That's probably going to need to be replaced. I saw some moisture signs in the attic. The roof's going to have to be new. You knew about all these problems when you bought the house. You knew about all these problems when you took the job. So it's like, oh, Brian Burns, what are Dan Morgan and Dave Canales going to do? Well, they better darn have budgeted for it. They better have had a plan because all of these problems were visible when they took the job.
So here's something you have to keep in mind when it comes to franchising Brian Burns if you don't get a long-term deal done. Is that, okay, you mentioned you can franchise tag him next offseason. Well, what happens if you don't work out a deal with Derrick Brown? You can't franchise both
True.
those guys, which means one's going to walk. Like, you're going to let that happen? So now you have to take that into consideration with how you're handling Brian Burns because, okay, if let's say they trade Brian Burns, okay, that franchise tag is available for Derrick Brown now next season. Because if you don't, or unless you get a deal done with Brian Burns, there's more than riding on this than just the deal with Brian Burns.
It puts a lot of pressure on your team when you go into an offseason with two legitimate franchise tag candidates.
Two premium star defenders.
We saw it a couple years ago with Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley. Both were obvious franchise tag candidates, right? A quarterback with 1 year of pretty good production, you probably wanted to see it for 2 years before you give him a long-term deal. But you also had a running back coming off an injury, and you probably wanted to see it for another year before you gave him any kind of long deal. So you end up tagging Saquon, giving the long-term deal to Daniel Jones. Buyer's remorse.
Well, they also screwed themselves with Jones because they never picked up his fifth-year option. So, I mean, they hurt themselves.
That's, again, being left into the problems that your previous regime left you. The other one that's happening this offseason was Mike Evans and Antoine Winfield. Two franchise tag candidates for the Bucs. They had to come up with the deal for Mike Evans in order to franchise tag Antoine Winfield, and it looks like they're going to do that. So there are trap doors. That's what I'm saying. Like, you have to be artful. You have to be skilled in how you navigate your way out of these problems that were left for you by the previous regime, but they were visible when you took the job.